Some people say revenge is a dish best served cold. I prefer mine documented, verified, and served with a side of screenshots. My name is Emma, and this is the story of how my sister Riley thought she could steal my fiancé and live happily ever after. What she didn't know was that I had a camera, a brain, and absolutely nothing left to lose. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The day I discovered Jake's betrayal, I was editing wedding photos for another couple, ironically enough. The irony wasn't lost on me later when I realized I'd been practicing for the most important photo shoot of my life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, with the moment I should have seen the red flags but was too blinded by love and family loyalty to notice. I've always been the reliable one. The sister who showed up early to family dinners, who remembered birthdays without Facebook reminders, who ran errands for mom when her arthritis acted up. Emma the dependable, Emma the photographer, who captured everyone else's perfect moments while waiting patiently for her own. At 28, I'd built a modest but successful photography business in Riverside, Oregon, specializing in weddings and family portraits. The irony of spending my days documenting other people's happiest moments while my own love life resembled a series of poorly composed snapshots wasn't lost on me. Then Jake Morrison walked into my studio on a rainy Tuesday in March, and everything changed. He claimed he needed headshots for his real estate development company, but the way he lingered after the session, asking about my work, my dreams, my favorite coffee shop, made it clear he was interested in more than professional photography. Jake was everything I thought I wanted. Tall, with the kind of confident smile that sold houses and won hearts. He had this way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room. When he asked me out that first time, suggesting dinner at Cascade Coffee, I actually pinched myself in the parking lot to make sure I wasn't dreaming. Our relationship unfolded like a perfectly planned photo shoot. Jake was attentive, romantic, and seemed genuinely interested in my work. He'd bring me coffee during long editing sessions, surprise me with flowers on random Wednesdays, and always had a good excuse for why we couldn't spend time at his place. He lived in Willowbrook, he explained, in a house he was renovating. The construction mess was embarrassing, and besides, he preferred my cozy studio apartment above my photography business. It felt intimate, he said, like getting to see the real me. I should have questioned why someone in real estate development was always paying for dinner in cash, or why his business calls always seemed to come when I was around, forcing him to step away and speak in hushed tones. I should have wondered why, in 6 months of dating, I'd never met any of his friends or colleagues. But love, I've learned, has a way of adjusting the aperture on reality, blurring the background details while keeping the subject in sharp, flattering focus. The proposal came 8 months after our first date, during what Jake called a spontaneous weekend getaway to the family lake house. He'd arranged everything with Mom, who was thrilled that her responsible daughter had finally found someone worthy of her devotion. The proposal itself was picture perfect, down to the golden hour lighting as Jake dropped to one knee on the dock, the lake reflecting the sunset behind him like a natural backdrop. The ring was modest but beautiful, a vintage setting he claimed had belonged to his grandmother. I said yes, obviously, and spent the drive home mentally planning our engagement photos. That's when Riley entered the picture, and everything I thought I knew about my life began to unravel like a poorly wound camera strap. Riley had been living in Los Angeles for the past 3 years, chasing her dreams of becoming a lifestyle influencer, while surviving on Mom's monthly checks and whatever income her Instagram partnerships generated. At 25, she'd perfected the art of looking effortlessly beautiful while doing absolutely nothing productive. Her feed was a carefully curated collection of coffee cups, sunset selfies, and motivational quotes about following your dreams, all shot with the kind of expensive equipment I'd saved months to afford. When Mom called to tell her about my engagement, Riley's response was immediate and dramatic. She absolutely had to come home to meet Jake and help plan the wedding. She'd catch the next flight to Portland, she declared, because family was everything, and she couldn't bear to miss this exciting time in my life. I should have recognized the warning signs in her enthusiasm. Riley had never shown interest in my relationships before, unless you counted the time in high school when she'd flirted with my prom date, until he asked her to dance instead of me. But I was too caught up in wedding planning euphoria to see clearly. Mom was thrilled to have both her daughters home, and I convinced myself that maybe this was the moment Riley and I would finally build the close sisterly relationship I'd always wanted. We'd never been particularly close growing up. The 3-year age gap felt like a decade when we were children, and our personalities were as different as our approaches to photography. I preferred candid shots that captured genuine emotion, while Riley lived for posed perfection that looked flawless but felt empty. Jake met Riley on a Thursday evening in late September, when Mom insisted on hosting a family dinner to properly introduce everyone. I'd been editing a wedding shoot all afternoon, losing track of time as I always did when I was in the zone, so I arrived at Mom's house 20 minutes late with developing solutions still staining my fingertips. Riley was already there, of course, holding court in the living room while Mom bustled around the kitchen, clearly thrilled to have her glamorous daughter home. I heard Jake's laugh before I saw him, a sound I'd grown to love over our months together. But something about it seemed different that evening, brighter somehow, more animated than I'd heard in weeks. When I walked into the living room, I found him sitting on the couch next to Riley, both of them leaning forward in conversation like old friends sharing secrets. Riley had changed clothes since I'd seen her that morning, trading her casual travel outfit for a flowing sundress that somehow managed to look both effortless and carefully planned. Her blonde hair caught the lamplight as she gestured, telling some story that had Jake completely captivated. They both looked up when I entered, and for just a moment I caught something in their expressions that made my stomach tighten. Guilt maybe, or surprise, as if they'd been caught doing something they shouldn't. But then Jake was standing, crossing the room to kiss me hello, and Riley was bouncing up to hug me, gushing about how wonderful my fiancé was and how lucky I was to have found someone so charming and successful. Dinner was a performance I didn't know I was auditioning for. Riley, who'd never shown any interest in my work, suddenly had 1,000 questions about wedding photography. Had I thought about who would shoot our wedding? Did I trust anyone else to capture such an important day? She'd met some amazing photographers in LA. She mentioned casually, artists who really understood how to make people look their absolute best. Maybe she could make some introductions. Jake, meanwhile, seemed fascinated by Riley's stories about Los Angeles, her influencer lifestyle, her plans to launch a lifestyle brand. He asked detailed questions about her business model, her follower engagement, her partnership strategies. I sat between them, cutting my salmon into increasingly smaller pieces, feeling like a spectator at my own engagement celebration. After dinner, while Mom and I cleared the dishes, I could hear them laughing on the back porch, their voices carrying through the screen door. Riley was showing Jake something on her phone, their heads bent close together as they scrolled through what I assumed were her Instagram posts. When we rejoined them, they were discussing fitness routines, apparently having discovered they both belonged to the same gym chain, though in different cities. The evening ended with Riley insisting on taking photos of Jake and me together, because she had such a good eye for lighting and angles. She positioned us on the porch steps, adjusting our poses with the confidence of someone who'd spent years perfecting her own image. Through her camera phone, she directed us to move closer, to look at each other instead of the camera, to try a more natural smile. Jake seemed more relaxed during this impromptu photo session than he had all evening, and I wondered if it was Riley's easy confidence behind the camera or something else entirely. The photos, I had to admit when she showed them to us afterward, were beautiful. She'd captured something soft and romantic in the golden porch light, and Jake and I looked genuinely happy together. Riley immediately posted one to her Instagram story, tagging both of us with heart emojis and captions about family and love and sisterly bonds. The response was immediate and enthusiastic from her followers, who apparently loved seeing this glimpse into her personal life. Driving home that night, Jake was quieter than usual, seeming lost in thought as we navigated the familiar streets back to my studio. When I asked if he'd enjoyed meeting Riley, his response was enthusiastic but somehow rehearsed, like he'd been practicing what to say. "She was great," he said, "really vibrant and interesting. I could see why she'd done so well in Los Angeles. It must run in the family, that photogenic quality, that natural charisma." I should have paid more attention to the way he said photogenic, like it was a quality he'd been looking for but hadn't realized until that moment. I should have noticed how he kept checking his phone during the drive, the soft glow of the screen illuminating a small smile I rarely saw anymore. Instead, I focused on planning our own engagement photos, mentally scouting locations around Riverside that would showcase our relationship as beautifully as Riley had managed, with just her phone and the porch light. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Riley suggesting we grab coffee and do some sister bonding. She wanted to hear all about my relationship with Jake, she said, and she had some ideas for the wedding that she was dying to share. I suggested Cascade Coffee, the place where Jake and I had our first date, thinking it would be nice to share that piece of our story with her. Riley arrived 15 minutes late, which was early for her, wearing what appeared to be a casual outfit but was clearly chosen with Instagram in mind. She ordered an elaborate drink with multiple modifications while I stuck with my usual black coffee, and we settled into a corner booth where the lighting was particularly flattering. She immediately started taking photos of her drink, the cafe interior, and us together, all while asking questions about Jake that felt oddly specific. How long had we been together? What did he do for work exactly? Did he travel much for business? Had I met his family? Where did he see himself in 5 years? She framed these questions as sisterly interest, claiming she wanted to make sure I'd found someone worthy of my devotion, but something about her intensity made me uncomfortable. It felt less like protective sister concern, and more like a job interview, as if she were gathering information for some unknown purpose. When I mentioned that Jake was renovating his house in Willowbrook and that's why we always stayed at my place, Riley's interest seemed to sharpen. She knew Willowbrook, she said. She'd looked at houses there when she first moved to LA, before deciding city life was more her speed. It was such an exclusive area, she mused, the kind of place where serious real estate developers would live. He must be doing really well for himself to afford something there. I found myself defending details about Jake that I'd never questioned before. Of course, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He was successful, I said, though I realized I'd never actually seen evidence of his work beyond the business cards and the story about needing headshots. Of course he was renovating, though I'd never driven by to see the house or met any contractors or workers. Of course he was legitimate, though something about having to say it out loud made doubt creep in like morning fog rolling over the mountains. Riley must have sensed my uncertainty because she quickly shifted the conversation to wedding planning, gushing about venues and flowers and dresses with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been planning her own wedding for years. She had connections, she said, photographers and planners and vendors who could make our day absolutely perfect. She even offered to help coordinate everything, since she had experience with event planning from her influencer work, and I was probably too busy with my own photography business to handle all the details. I should have said no. I should have recognized the way she was inserting herself into every aspect of my relationship, offering solutions to problems I didn't know I had. Instead, I felt grateful for her interest, touched that she wanted to be involved in such an important time in my life. When she suggested the 4 of us have dinner together soon, her and me and Jake and maybe someone she was seeing in LA who might be visiting, I agreed immediately. It seemed like the perfect way to blend our old family dynamic with my new relationship. That dinner, planned for the following Saturday at a trendy restaurant in downtown Portland, would turn out to be the beginning of the end of everything I thought I knew about my life. But at the time, sitting in Cascade Coffee with Riley's excited chatter filling the space between us, I felt hopeful about our future as sisters, and confident in my relationship with Jake. I even let her take a selfie of us together, heads pressed close, coffee cups positioned artfully in the foreground. She posted it immediately with a caption about sister time and wedding planning, and how excited she was to be home for such a special time. The likes and comments started rolling in before we'd even finished our drinks, and I found myself caught up in the excitement of sharing my happiness with the world, even if it was through Riley's much larger platform. Looking back, I can see how perfectly she'd orchestrated that entire conversation, gathering intelligence while appearing to offer support, positioning herself as an essential part of my wedding planning while subtly undermining my confidence in my own relationship. But at the time, I was just happy to have my sister's attention and approval, something I'd been seeking my entire life without realizing it. The photograph she took that day would later become evidence, though not in the way either of us expected. Sometimes the most damaging pictures are the ones where everyone is smiling, where the surface looks perfect but something darker lurks just beneath the carefully composed frame. Riley had always been better at reading cameras than reading people, But she'd forgotten that I'd been studying both for years, and I was about to get a masterclass in recognizing the difference between what people show you and what they're actually doing. The week between our coffee date and the planned dinner passed in a blur of wedding planning activities that Riley had somehow managed to coordinate. She'd made calls to photographers, visited venues, and even scheduled a dress shopping trip for the following weekend. Her efficiency was impressive, though something about the speed at which she was moving made me feel like I was watching my own wedding planning from the sidelines rather than participating in it. Jake seemed unusually busy that week, with more business calls and meetings than usual. He'd apologized for being distracted, explaining that a big development deal was in its final stages and required all his attention. I understood, of course, and threw myself into my own work, editing photos and booking new clients. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted since that dinner at Mom's house, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what felt different. The night before our double date, Riley called to confirm the details, her voice bright with an excitement that seemed disproportionate to dinner plans. She'd managed to get us a reservation at Meridian, one of Portland's most exclusive restaurants, though she was vague about how she'd secured a table at such short notice. Her date from LA had canceled at the last minute, she explained, so it would just be the three of us. But that was actually better because we could focus on really getting to know each other as a family. I should have questioned why she was so eager to spend time alone with Jake and me, especially after canceling her own date. I should have wondered why someone who'd been in Los Angeles for 3 years had such good connections at Portland restaurants. Instead, I spent the day editing an engagement session I'd shot earlier that week, losing myself in the process of bringing out the love and connection between my clients, while trying to ignore the growing feeling that something in my own relationship was slipping out of focus. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made everything feel possible. I chose my outfit carefully, a navy dress that photographed well but didn't look like I was trying too hard, paired with the vintage earrings Jake had given me for my birthday. When he picked me up, he seemed nervous, checking his appearance in my hallway mirror and asking twice if I was sure about the restaurant choice. Riley was already at Meridian when we arrived, somehow having secured the best table in the house with a view of the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. She'd dressed for the occasion in a way that managed to look effortless while clearly being calculated for maximum impact. Her outfit was Instagram-ready but not obviously so, the kind of carefully curated casualness that took hours to achieve. Dinner began pleasantly enough, with Riley regaling us with stories about Los Angeles that had Jake asking detailed questions about neighborhoods, business opportunities, and lifestyle costs. She was at her most charming, making self-deprecating jokes about her influencer career, while somehow managing to highlight how successful and independent she'd become. The conversation flowed easily, perhaps too easily, and I found myself relaxing into the evening despite my earlier apprehensions. It was during dessert that I excused myself to use the restroom, leaving Jake and Riley alone at the table for what I assumed would be a few minutes of polite small talk. When I returned, threading my way through the crowded restaurant, I caught sight of our table from across the room and stopped short. They were leaning toward each other across the small table, Riley's hand resting on Jake's arm as she spoke intently into his ear. Their body language spoke of intimacy, of shared secrets, of connection that went far beyond the polite getting-to-know-you conversation I'd expected. I stood frozen among the other diners for a moment that felt like hours, watching my fiancé and my sister in a tableau that made everything suddenly, terrifyingly clear. This wasn't the beginning of something between them. This was the continuation of something that had already begun, something I'd been too trusting or too naive to recognize, until this moment when I was seeing it from the outside. With the clarity that comes from unexpected perspective, they sprang apart when they noticed me approaching, Jake's face flushing as he reached for his water glass while Riley's expression smoothed into a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. By the time I reached the table, they were both looking at me with the kind of careful attention that confirmed my worst suspicions while they chatted about how good the dessert looked and whether I wanted to share. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of forced normalcy, with me playing the role of unsuspecting fiancé while gathering every detail that might serve as evidence later. I noticed how Riley knew exactly how Jake liked his coffee, how they shared inside jokes that seemed to have developed during the few days they'd known each other, how they both reached for the check simultaneously before Jake insisted on paying. During the drive home, Jake was unusually quiet, claiming he had a headache from the wine and needed to concentrate on driving. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the familiar streets of Riverside, and realized that everything I thought I knew about my life had just shifted into a completely different frame. The reliable Emma, the trusting Emma, the Emma who always saw the best in people, had just been given a masterclass in betrayal, and she was already planning her response. That night, after Jake dropped me off with a distracted kiss and a promise to call tomorrow, I sat in my studio surrounded by wedding photos I'd taken for other couples, and began to plan the most important photo shoot of my career. Because if there's one thing I'd learned in my years of capturing people's most important moments, it's that the truth always reveals itself eventually. You just have to know how to frame the shot and when to press the shutter. The morning after the restaurant revelation, I woke up with the kind of clarity that comes from having your world completely rearranged overnight. While Jake slept peacefully beside me, completely unaware that his carefully constructed facade had crumbled over dessert and coffee, I lay staring at the ceiling of my studio apartment, mentally cataloging every detail that now made perfect sense in this new context. His reluctance to have me visit his house wasn't about construction mess. His cash payments weren't about preferring not to use credit cards. His mysterious business calls weren't about real estate deals. Everything I'd rationalized away as quirky or professional now formed a pattern that pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Jake Morrison was not who he claimed to be, and my sister had figured it out long before I had. I slipped out of bed quietly, padding barefoot across the cold hardwood floors to my desk where my laptop waited like a faithful companion. If there was one thing my years in photography had taught me, it was the importance of documentation. Every wedding, every family portrait, every corporate headshot began with research. Understanding your subjects, their relationships, their dynamics, their secrets. I'd been photographing Jake for months without really seeing him, but that was about to change. The first thing I discovered was that Jake Morrison, successful real estate developer, had virtually no online presence. No company website, no professional social media accounts, no mention in local business publications or real estate listings. For someone supposedly building his career in an industry that thrived on networking and visibility, his digital footprint was remarkably small. Too small, I realized, for someone legitimate. I spent the next 3 hours following digital breadcrumbs, using every search technique I'd learned from years of researching potential clients and vendors. What I found, or rather what I didn't find, painted a picture that made my stomach churn with a mixture of rage and embarrassment. The address he'd given me for his Willowbrook house belonged to a property that had been sold 6 months before we met. His supposed business phone number was registered to a service that provided temporary lines for people who needed to appear more established than they actually were. But the real bombshell came when I decided to reverse search the photos from his headshot session, the ones that had supposedly launched our relationship. Professional habit made me run them through image recognition software, a tool I used to ensure my own work wasn't being stolen or misused online. What came back made me nearly drop my laptop. Jake Morrison's face appeared in at least 6 different social media profiles, attached to different names, different professions, different life stories. In one, he was Marcus Thompson, a fitness trainer in Seattle. In another, David Chen, a marketing consultant in San Francisco. Each profile was carefully crafted, with just enough detail to seem legitimate but not enough to be easily verified. Each one featured the same confident smile, the same practiced charm, the same ability to make someone feel like they were the only person in the room. My hands were shaking as I screenshotted everything, creating a digital file that would have made any private investigator proud. But this wasn't just about gathering evidence anymore. This was about understanding how thoroughly I'd been played, and more importantly, how Riley fit into this elaborate deception. I was so absorbed in my research that I didn't hear Jake stirring until he was already padding toward the bathroom, mumbling something about needing to leave early for a morning meeting. I quickly minimized my browser windows, switching to an innocuous photo editing project as he emerged, hair tousled and looking deceptively innocent in the morning light. "Morning, beautiful," he said, kissing the top of my head as he reached for the coffee I'd brewed hours earlier. "You're up early. Couldn't sleep?" "Just had some inspiration for a new project," I replied, keeping my voice carefully neutral as I watched him in my peripheral vision. "You know how it is when creativity strikes." He nodded, though I noticed how his eyes flicked toward my laptop screen, trying to see what I was working on. This small gesture, which I might have missed yesterday, now felt significant. How many other signs had I ignored? How many times had he been checking up on me, monitoring what I knew or suspected? "I might be late tonight," he said, gathering his clothes from yesterday that were scattered across my bedroom floor. "This deal I'm working on is heating up, and you know how these things go." I knew exactly how these things went, though not in the way he meant. "Of course," I said. "I'll probably be editing late anyway. Rachel wants to meet for coffee later to discuss a potential collaboration." Rachel Chen was my oldest friend and my most trusted ally in the photography world. We'd met in college, bonded over our shared love of capturing authentic moments, and had been supporting each other's careers ever since. More importantly, Rachel had a degree in computer science that she'd put to use building one of the most sophisticated photo editing and management systems I'd ever seen. If anyone could help me document what I was discovering about Jake, it would be Rachel. Jake's response to hearing her name was subtle but telling. A slight tightening around his eyes, a pause that lasted just a beat too long. "Rachel," he repeated. "I don't think I've met her yet." "She's been traveling a lot for work," I explained, though I realized with a start that I'd been unconsciously keeping my closest friendships separate from my relationship with Jake. Another red flag I'd missed. "She's been wanting to meet you, though. Maybe we can all have dinner soon." "Definitely," Jake said, though his tone suggested the opposite. "I'd love to meet your friends." After he left, promising to text me later about dinner plans, I immediately called Rachel. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright with the energy of someone who'd already been awake for hours working on client projects. "Emma, please tell me you're calling with good news about that engagement shoot you mentioned. I've been dying to see those photos." "Rachel, I need your help with something else entirely," I said, cutting straight to the point. "How quickly can you meet me? And bring your laptop. The good one." There was a pause, and when Rachel spoke again, her voice had shifted to the focused tone she used when facing a technical challenge. "How serious are we talking?" Scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is helping you pick Instagram filters and 10 is someone's about to go to jail. "Probably a 7, I said, then reconsidered. "Maybe an 8. "Cascade coffee in 30 minutes, she said without hesitation. "Order me the largest coffee they have and find the corner table where no one can see our screens." Rachel arrived 28 minutes later, her messenger bag loaded with enough technology to run a small surveillance operation. She took one look at my face and immediately set up her laptop without asking any questions, creating a mobile command center that would have impressed any private detective. For the next hour, I laid out everything I'd discovered about Jake while Rachel's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up databases and running searches that went far beyond anything I could have managed on my own. What we uncovered was worse than I'd imagined. Jake Morrison, or whatever his real name was, appeared to be running what Rachel called a long con, targeting women with established careers and financial stability. The pattern was consistent across multiple cities. Identify a successful but lonely woman, create an elaborate false identity that would appeal to her specific desires, build trust through romantic attention, and then slowly gain access to her resources, connections, or in some cases, her business assets. "Look at this," Rachel said, pointing to a series of transactions she'd traced through public records. 3 different women in 3 different cities, all successful professionals, all involved with versions of this same guy. And in each case, money went missing from business accounts, or expensive equipment disappeared, or valuable contacts were somehow compromised. My blood ran cold as I realized what this meant. He's not just lying about who he is, he's stealing from these women. Exactly. "And Emma," Rachel looked up from her screen, her expression serious. "I think your sister might be involved. Look at this." She pulled up Riley's Instagram account, scrolling back through several months of posts. What I saw made everything click into place with sickening clarity. Riley's sudden move back to Los Angeles coincided almost exactly with Jake's appearance in my life. Her mysterious funding for her lifestyle brand, her knowledge of expensive restaurants and exclusive venues, her confident insertion into my relationship with Jake. It all made sense now. "They've been working together," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "She didn't come home to celebrate my engagement. She came home to help him rob me." Rachel nodded grimly. "It looks like they've done this before. Different cities, different targets, but the same basic approach. Riley plays the supportive friend or family member, gains the target's trust, gathers information about their finances and business, while Jake handles the romantic manipulation." I stared at the evidence spread across our two laptop screens, feeling a strange sense of detachment from my own life. Yesterday, I'd been a successful photographer planning her wedding to a charming real estate developer, worried about venue choices and guest lists. Today, I was the intended victim of an elaborate fraud scheme orchestrated by my own sister and the man I'd planned to marry. "What do?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Rachel leaned back in her chair, studying me with the analytical gaze she usually reserved for complex technical problems. "Well, you could go to the police, but proving fraud is difficult when you haven't actually lost anything yet. You could confront them directly, but that just gives them a chance to disappear and find new targets." "Or?" I prompted, sensing there was a third option. "Or," Rachel said with a slow smile, "we beat them at their own game. We document everything, gather irrefutable evidence, and then we spring the trap when they least expect it." The idea should have terrified me. The old Emma, the reliable Emma, who always played by the rules and trusted people to do the right thing, would have been horrified at the suggestion of orchestrating her own deception. But the new Emma, the one who'd been forged in the fires of betrayal and humiliation, found the prospect surprisingly appealing. "What did you have in mind?" I asked. Rachel opened a new document on her laptop and began typing. "First, we need to understand their timeline. When are they planning to make their move? What's their endgame with you specifically? Then, we gather evidence of their previous cons, establish a pattern of behavior that proves this isn't just a relationship gone wrong. Finally, we create a situation where they reveal themselves completely, in a way that can't be denied or explained away." "You want me to pretend I don't know anything?" I said, understanding immediately. "Exactly. Keep playing the trusting fiancé while we build our case. Let them think they're still in control while we document every lie, every manipulation, every step of their plan." The thought of continuing to smile at Jake, to let him touch me and lie to me while I knew the truth, made my skin crawl. But the alternative was watching him and Riley disappear into the wind, free to victimize someone else. Someone who might not have the resources or support system to recover from their betrayal. "I can do it," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "How long do you think we'll need?" Rachel was already pulling up calendar applications and project management tools, approaching this like any other complex photography assignment. Based on their previous patterns, I'd guess they're planning to make their move within the next few weeks. Probably around some significant event where emotions are running high and logical thinking might be compromised. "Like a wedding," I said quietly. "Like a wedding," she confirmed. "Which gives us maybe 2 or 3 weeks to gather everything we need and set up our own surprise." We spent the rest of the afternoon creating what Rachel called our documentation protocol. Every interaction with Jake would be recorded when possible, either through audio on my phone or video from hidden cameras Rachel could help me set up. Every lie would be fact-checked and documented. Every financial transaction, every business claim, every detail of his supposed life would be verified and cataloged. More importantly, we would begin building evidence of Riley's involvement, tracking her movements, her communications, her financial transactions during this period. If they were working together, there would be proof, and we would find it. "One more thing," Rachel said as we packed up our impromptu command center. "We need to protect your assets starting now. Move your business funds to a new account they don't know about. Change your passwords on everything. Install security software on all your devices. If they're planning to rob you, we're not going to make it easy." That evening, I sat in my studio preparing for Jake's return, like an actress getting ready for the performance of her life. I practiced my smile in the mirror, rehearsed responses to his lies, and prepared to become someone I'd never been before. A woman capable of deception, of patience in the face of betrayal, of turning the tables on people who'd underestimated her completely. When Jake arrived at 8 o'clock with takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant and stories about his challenging but ultimately successful day, I smiled and kissed him hello, and asked all the right questions about his fictional business deals. But inside, I was taking notes, gathering evidence, and planning the most important photo shoot of my career. The documentation had begun, and for the first time since discovering their betrayal, I felt like I was back in control of my own story. They'd written me as the naive victim in their elaborate screenplay, but they'd forgotten that I was the one behind the camera, and I always got the final shot. Over the next several days, I fell into a routine that felt surreal in its normalcy. Jake would leave in the mornings for his supposed business meetings, and I would immediately begin my real work, documenting his lies, tracing his movements, and building the case that would eventually bring down his entire operation. Rachel had helped me install sophisticated tracking software on my devices that could monitor any attempts to access my accounts or gather information about my business. She'd also provided me with recording equipment so small and advanced that I felt like a character in a spy movie, documenting conversations and interactions that revealed more about Jake's true nature with each passing day. The most disturbing discovery came when I followed him one Tuesday morning, using the photography skills I'd developed for wildlife and street photography to remain unseen while tracking his movements through downtown Riverside. Instead of heading to business meetings, Jake drove to a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, where he met with Riley in a scene that confirmed every suspicion I'd harbored about their relationship. From my concealed position in the parking lot, telephoto lens focused on their motel room window, I captured images that told the story more clearly than any confession could have. Riley and Jake weren't just collaborating on a con, they were romantically involved, had probably been involved long before either of them had contacted me. Every moment of their supposed first meeting at Mom's house had been carefully choreographed. Every surprised reaction and getting-to-know-you conversation had been pure performance. The photos I took that day were technically perfect but emotionally devastating. Sharp focus, good lighting, clear composition that left no doubt about what was happening between them. Riley throwing her head back in laughter at something Jake said. Jake's hand on her face in a gesture of intimate familiarity. The two of them embracing with the passion of people who'd been separated and were finally reunited. I sat in my car afterward, staring at the images on my camera's LCD screen, and felt something inside me crystallize into a resolve I'd never experienced before. This wasn't just about exposing their lies anymore. This was about justice, about consequences, about ensuring that their carefully planned betrayal became the catalyst for their own destruction. That evening, Jake returned home with flowers and apologies for being late, claiming that meetings had run long and traffic had been terrible. I accepted his kiss and his excuses with the same smile I'd been practicing, but I was calculating, planning, preparing for the moment when all their deceptions would be laid bare for the world to see. "I've been thinking," I said as we shared dinner from the containers he'd brought home, "maybe we should start planning our engagement party. Something small, just family and close friends, before we get too caught up in wedding planning." Jake's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and I caught a flicker of something in his expression before he recovered. "That sounds nice," he said carefully. "When were you thinking? Maybe in a couple of weeks?" Riley's been so helpful with wedding planning, and I know she'd love to help organize something special. We could have it at the lake house, make it really intimate and meaningful. I watched his face as he processed this information, knowing that he was probably already calculating how an engagement party might fit into whatever timeline he and Riley had established for their con. What he didn't know was that I was calculating too, planning an event that would serve as the perfect stage for the revelation I was preparing. "Let me talk to Riley about it," he said finally. "I'm sure she'd be thrilled to help." "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone, "let me call her right now. I'm so excited about this idea." Before Jake could object, I was dialing Riley's number, putting the phone on speaker so he could hear the entire conversation. Riley answered with her usual breathless enthusiasm, though I thought I detected a note of caution when she heard that Jake was there too. "Emma, perfect timing. I was just thinking about you. How are the wedding plans coming along?" "Great," I said, watching Jake's face carefully. "Actually, I'm calling because I want to plan an engagement party. Something special, just family and close friends. I was hoping you'd help me organize it." There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long before Riley's enthusiasm kicked into overdrive. Oh my God, yes, that sounds absolutely perfect. What are you thinking? Where? I have so many ideas already. I was thinking the lake house in 2 weeks. Maybe that Saturday afternoon? Something casual but elegant, you know? And Riley, I want you to be my photographer for the event. I know you're not a professional, but you have such a good eye, and I trust you to capture all the important moments. This suggestion seemed to surprise both Riley and Jake, though for different reasons. Riley's pause was longer this time, and when she spoke, her voice had lost some of its artificial brightness. Are you sure? I mean, I'd be honored, but this is such an important event. Wouldn't you want a real photographer? You are a real photographer, I insisted, meaning every word in ways she couldn't possibly understand. Besides, who better to capture our family celebration than family? I want someone who really understands what this means to all of us. After hanging up, Jake was quiet for the rest of the evening, claiming he had emails to catch up on for work. I watched him from the corner of my eye as he typed on his laptop, wondering if he was communicating with Riley about this new development, adjusting their plans to account for the engagement party timeline. What neither of them knew was that I was adjusting my plans too, creating an event that would serve as the perfect finale to weeks of careful documentation. An engagement party where the real surprise wouldn't be the celebration of my fake relationship, but the exposure of their elaborate deception. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the countdown to revelation had begun. In 2 weeks, everyone would finally see the truth about Jake Morrison and Riley. But by then, I'd have gathered enough evidence to ensure that this was the last con they'd ever attempt together. As I lay in bed that night, listening to Jake's carefully measured breathing beside me, I thought about the woman I'd been just a week ago, and the woman I was becoming. The old Emma would have been heartbroken, devastated, probably willing to forgive and forget for the sake of keeping the peace. But the new Emma, forged in betrayal and strengthened by purpose, was ready to show them exactly what happened when you underestimated someone who'd spent years learning how to see the truth through a lens. The engagement party planning consumed the next 2 weeks in ways that would have seemed normal to any outside observer. Riley threw herself into the role of devoted sister and event coordinator with an enthusiasm that might have been touching if I hadn't known the truth. She spent hours on the phone with caterers, florists, and rental companies, creating what she promised would be an unforgettable celebration of love and family unity. What she didn't realize was that every phone call was being recorded. Every vendor contact was being documented, and every financial transaction was being traced through the sophisticated monitoring system Rachel had helped me establish. We weren't just planning an engagement party anymore. We were orchestrating the most elaborate sting operation ever disguised as a family celebration. Jake's behavior during this period became increasingly erratic, swinging between moments of genuine affection that made me question my own discoveries and periods of distraction that confirmed everything I'd learned about his true nature. He would disappear for hours at a time, claiming to handle mysterious business deals that required his immediate attention, only to return with stories that fell apart under the gentlest questioning. The morning of our engagement party dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of perfect autumn light that photographers dream about. I woke up alone in my studio apartment, Jake having left early to handle what he claimed were last-minute preparations for a business presentation he had to give the following week. His absence was actually a relief, giving me time to prepare for what I knew would be the most challenging performance of my life. Rachel arrived at sunrise with coffee and the final pieces of equipment we'd need for the day. Hidden cameras that looked like decorative objects, audio recording devices disguised as party favors, and backup systems that would ensure we captured every moment of what was about to unfold. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, studying my face as we sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the technology that would document the end of my relationship and my sister's betrayal. "I don't think anyone can be ready for something like this," I admitted, wrapping my hands around my coffee mug for warmth and comfort. "But I need to know the truth, and I need everyone else to see it too." The lake house had been transformed into something that belonged in a wedding magazine, thanks to Riley's careful attention to every detail. White linens draped the outdoor furniture, strings of lights created a magical canopy over the deck, and flowers in shades of cream and gold gave the entire space an ethereal quality that would photograph beautifully. Riley herself looked stunning in a flowing dress that managed to be appropriate for the occasion while still ensuring she'd be the most photogenic person there after me. She greeted me with enthusiasm that seemed genuine, throwing her arms around me and declaring that everything was absolutely perfect for my special day. "I can't believe how beautiful everything looks," I said, and I meant it. Whatever else Riley was guilty of, she had impeccable taste and an eye for creating Instagram-worthy moments. "Only the best for my sister," she replied, squeezing my hand. "This is going to be a day none of us will ever forget." The irony of her words wasn't lost on me, though she had no idea just how prophetic they would prove to be. Guests began arriving around noon, starting with Mom, who was practically glowing with pride at having both her daughters home and one of them getting married to such a wonderful man. Tom and Sarah, my closest friends from college, arrived with congratulations and a beautiful gift that made me feel guilty about the deception I was orchestrating, even though I knew it was necessary. Jake appeared just as the party was hitting its stride, looking handsome and charming in the casual elegance he'd perfected over months of playing the role of successful businessman and devoted fiancé. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands with the men and charming the women with the kind of attention that made everyone feel special and important. I watched him work the room and marveled at his skill. He remembered names and details about people he'd met only once, asked thoughtful questions about their lives and careers, and somehow managed to make each conversation feel like the most important interaction of his day. If I hadn't known what I knew about his true nature, I would have been proud to be marrying someone so socially adept and genuinely interested in others. But I did know the truth, and watching him perform this elaborate charade for an audience of innocent people who believed they were celebrating genuine love made my stomach churn with a mixture of rage and disgust. Riley had positioned herself as the unofficial photographer for the event, moving through the party with her expensive camera and directing people into poses that would create the perfect visual narrative of our engagement celebration. She had a genuine talent for capturing flattering angles and authentic-looking moments, even when those moments were carefully orchestrated rather than spontaneous. What she didn't know was that Rachel had positioned herself strategically around the property, with recording equipment that was capturing every conversation, every private moment, and every interaction that revealed the truth beneath the beautiful surface we'd all worked so hard to create. The first crack in Jake's facade appeared during the toast portion of the afternoon. Uncle Robert, who'd driven down from Seattle for the occasion, stood up with his champagne glass and began a rambling speech about the importance of family and the joy of watching young people find true love in an increasingly complicated world. "I remember when Emma was just a little girl with her first camera," he said, smiling at me across the crowded deck. "She was always trying to capture the perfect moment, the exact second when something real and beautiful was happening. And now she's found that same kind of authenticity in her relationship with Jake." I saw Jake's expression flicker for just a moment, a micro-expression of discomfort or guilt that anyone who wasn't looking for it would have missed entirely. But I was looking for it, and I caught it, and I knew that somewhere beneath his charming exterior, the weight of his deception was beginning to show. The second crack appeared when Mrs. Henderson from down the road asked Jake about his business, expressing interest in potentially listing her late husband's property for development. Jake's response was smooth and professional, but he made the mistake of providing specific details about zoning regulations and market conditions that Rachel and I had already verified were completely incorrect. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been involved in real estate for 30 years, raised an eyebrow at his claims, but was too polite to contradict him directly. Instead, she asked follow-up questions that revealed just how little Jake actually knew about the industry he claimed to work in. I watched him flounder slightly, covering his ignorance with charm and deflection. But the damage was done for anyone paying attention. The third and most significant crack came when Riley, in her role as photographer, suggested that Jake and I recreate our first dance for a romantic photo opportunity. She'd set up the perfect shot on the dock, with the late afternoon sun creating a golden backdrop that would make any couple look like they were starring in their own fairy tale. "Come on, you two," she called, gesturing for us to move into position. "Let's capture the magic of your love story." As Jake and I moved into each other's arms, swaying to music that existed only in our imagination, I felt his body tense in a way that had nothing to do with performance nerves. His eyes, which had been warm and loving for the benefit of our audience, went cold and calculating as he looked at me, as if he were seeing me clearly for the first time. "You know," he said quietly, his voice pitched so only I could hear, "you've been acting strange lately. Distant. Is everything okay between us?" It was a fishing expedition, an attempt to gauge whether I suspected anything about his true nature or his relationship with Riley. The old Emma would have immediately reassured him, would have blamed stress or work pressure for any changes in her behavior. But the new Emma, the one who'd been forged in the fires of betrayal and strengthened by weeks of careful planning, saw this moment for what it was, an opportunity. "Actually," I said, matching his quiet tone, "I've been thinking a lot about our future together, about trust and honesty, and what it really means to build a life with someone." Something shifted in his expression, a wariness that confirmed every suspicion I'd harbored about his true feelings for me. "That's good," he said carefully. "Trust is important in any relationship." "Yes, it is," I agreed, meeting his gaze directly. "It's especially important when you're planning to spend your life with someone, when you're sharing your deepest secrets, your financial information, your professional contacts, when you're making yourself completely vulnerable to another person." The color drained from Jake's face so quickly that I thought he might actually faint. Around us, the party continued, guests laughing and chatting and celebrating what they believed was the beginning of a beautiful marriage. But in our small bubble of space on the dock, with Riley's camera capturing what she thought would be romantic imagery, a different kind of truth was being revealed. "Emma," Jake started, but I cut him off. "Smile," I said, my own smile bright and genuine for the first time in weeks. "Riley's taking pictures." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of forced normalcy, with Jake growing increasingly agitated, and Riley seeming to sense that something had shifted without understanding exactly what. I played my part perfectly, the radiant bride-to-be surrounded by family and friends, basking in the love and support of everyone who cared about my happiness. But beneath the surface I was counting down the minutes, until the moment I'd been planning for weeks, the moment when all the careful documentation and patient preparation would finally pay off in a revelation that would expose everything Jake and Riley had been hiding. As the sun began to set and guests started talking about heading home, I stood up and called for everyone's attention. The crowd quieted, expecting perhaps a thank you speech or another toast to mark the end of a perfect celebration. "Before everyone leaves," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the deck, "I have a little surprise, something special I want to share with all of you." Jake's expression went from wary to panicked as I moved toward the house, ostensibly to retrieve whatever surprise I had planned. Riley followed me with her camera, probably thinking this would be the perfect candid moment to capture for her social media documentation of the day. What I actually retrieved was my laptop and a portable projector that Rachel had helped me set up earlier in the day. As I connected the devices and began pulling up the files I'd spent weeks compiling, I could feel the energy of the party shifting from celebratory to confused. "I know this seems unusual," I said, addressing the crowd while Jake stood frozen beside the projector screen, "but I've put together a little slideshow about Jake and my relationship, about how we met, how our love story developed, and some things I've learned about the man I'm planning to marry." The first image that appeared on the screen was innocuous enough, Jake's original headshot, the one from our first meeting at my studio. The crowd murmured appreciatively at how handsome and professional he looked. The second image was a screenshot of one of his fake social media profiles, showing the same photo attached to a completely different name and profession in a different city. The murmurs turned to confused silence as I clicked through slide after slide, each one revealing another layer of Jake's elaborate deception. Different names, different careers, different life stories, all featuring the same face that was currently pale with terror beside me. "This is Marcus Thompson from Seattle," I said conversationally, as if I were giving a normal slideshow presentation. "Fitness trainer, loves hiking and motivational quotes. And this is David Chen from San Francisco, marketing consultant with a passion for wine tasting and travel." Riley had stopped taking pictures, her camera hanging forgotten from her neck as she stared at the screen in what appeared to be genuine shock. Either she was a better actress than I'd given her credit for, or there were aspects of Jake's deception that even she hadn't been aware of. But my personal favorite, I continued, clicking to the next slide, is this series of photos I took just last week. The images from the motel parking lot filled the screen in sharp, undeniable detail. Jake and Riley embracing with the passion of longtime lovers. Riley's head thrown back in laughter at something Jake was saying. The two of them together in ways that left no doubt about the true nature of their relationship. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the lake lapping against the dock, birds calling from the trees, and the barely audible sound of multiple people holding their breath as they processed what they were seeing. Mom was the first to find her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Riley? What is this?" Riley's response was to drop her camera and run, not toward the house to gather her things or toward her car to make an escape, but directly to Jake, throwing her arms around him in a gesture that confirmed everything the photos had already revealed. "It's not what it looks like," she said, though her actions made it clear that it was exactly what it looked like. Jake, meanwhile, had found his voice and was attempting to regain control of the situation through the same charm and manipulation that had gotten him this far. "Emma, I can explain everything. These photos, they're taken out of context. Riley and I were just friends, and she was upset about something, and I was comforting her." "Really?" I said, clicking to the next slide, which showed financial records Rachel had helped me trace. "Then I'm sure. You can explain these bank transfers from Riley's account to yours, dating back 6 months. Or these travel receipts showing you've been following the same route through multiple cities, targeting the same type of women in each location." The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and presented with the kind of clinical precision that left no room for doubt or alternative interpretation. Every lie, every manipulation, every aspect of their elaborate con was laid bare for everyone to see. Uncle Robert was the first guest to speak up, his voice rough with barely controlled anger. "Son, I think you need to leave. Now." Other voices joined his, a chorus of family and friends who'd been deceived and manipulated, demanding answers and explanations that Jake couldn't provide. The party that had begun as a celebration of love and family had transformed into a reckoning that stripped away every pretense and revealed the ugly truth beneath the beautiful surface. Jake made one last attempt to salvage the situation, turning to me with what he probably thought was his most convincing expression of wounded innocence. "Emma, please. You're making a terrible mistake. I love you. Everything I've done because I love you." "No," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Everything you've done because you thought I was an easy target. Because you saw a lonely woman with a successful business and decided she'd be perfect for your next con. But you made one crucial mistake." "What's that?" he asked, though he looked like he already knew he didn't want to hear the answer. "You forgot that I'm a photographer?" I said, gesturing to the screen full of evidence behind me. "And photographers see everything. We document everything. We capture truth, even when people are trying desperately to hide it." The final slide in my presentation wasn't a photo at all, but a simple text message. "Police have been contacted. Evidence has been submitted. Investigation is ongoing." Jake's face went from pale to gray as he realized that this wasn't just a public humiliation, but the beginning of legal consequences that would follow him far beyond this ruined engagement party. He looked around the deck at the faces of people who'd trusted him, liked him, welcomed him into their family, and saw nothing but disgust and betrayal reflected back at him. Without another word, he turned and walked away, not toward his car or toward any attempt to gather his belongings, but simply away, as if he could somehow escape the consequences of his actions by putting physical distance between himself and the evidence of his crimes. Riley tried to follow him, but Mom's voice stopped her cold. "Don't you dare," Mom said, her voice carrying authority I'd rarely heard from her. "Don't you dare walk away from this family after what you've done to your sister." The confrontation that followed was painful and necessary, a reckoning between sisters that had been building for years, beneath the surface of our complicated relationship. Riley's explanations were a mixture of justification and self-pity, painting herself as another victim of Jake's manipulation, while simultaneously revealing just how deeply she'd been involved in planning my betrayal. But the most shocking revelation came when Riley, cornered and desperate, finally told the truth about how long she'd been working with Jake and how many other women they'd targeted together. The scope of their operation was staggering, a multi-state con game that had been going on for years, with Riley serving as both scout and accomplice in dozens of elaborate schemes. As the last guests left and the sun set over the lake, I found myself standing alone on the dock where, just hours earlier, I'd been posing for romantic photos with a man I'd planned to marry. The party decorations still hung from the trees, and the remnants of our celebration were scattered across tables that would need to be cleaned up tomorrow. But for the first time in months, I felt truly alone in a way that was liberating rather than lonely. The elaborate deception that had defined my life for nearly a year was finally over. And while the ending wasn't what I'd planned or hoped for, it was honest in a way that felt like freedom. Rachel appeared beside me as I stood there, having stayed behind to help with cleanup and to make sure I was okay after the emotional devastation of the day. "How do you feel?" she asked, settling beside me on the dock. "Empty," I said honestly, but also relieved, like I've been holding my breath for months and can finally exhale. "What happens now?" I thought about the question, considering the debris of my old life and the possibilities of whatever came next. "Now I rebuild," I said. But this time, I do it with my eyes wide open. Above us, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the sound of cars driving away, carrying the news of this day to the rest of our small community. By tomorrow, everyone would know the truth about Jake Morrison and Riley, but they'd also know the truth about me, that I was stronger than anyone had given me credit for, and that underestimating me had been the biggest mistake my enemies could have made. The 3 days following the engagement party passed in a strange suspension of time, as if the entire world had shifted off its axis and was slowly trying to right itself. My phone rang constantly with calls from relatives, friends, and even strangers who'd heard about what happened through the intricate network of small-town gossip. Some called to offer support, others to satisfy their curiosity, and a few to share their own stories of close calls with people who'd seemed too good to be true. Detective Maria Santos contacted me on Tuesday morning, her voice professional but kind, as she explained the process of building a criminal case against Jake and potentially Riley. The evidence I'd gathered was extensive and well documented, she said, but prosecuting con artists was often complicated by jurisdictional issues and the difficulty of proving intent to defraud rather than simply relationship fraud. "The good news," Detective Santos explained during our meeting at the police station, "is that your documentation is some of the most thorough I've seen in cases like this. The bad news is that your Jake Morrison appears to be very good at disappearing when things get complicated." She spread a file across the table between us, revealing what the police had discovered about Jake's real identity and criminal history. His actual name was James Mitchell, and he'd been running variations of this same con for nearly 8 years, moving from city to city and leaving a trail of financial damage and broken hearts in his wake. "We've connected him to at least 12 other cases across 7 states, Detective Santos continued. The amounts stolen range from a few $1,000s to nearly $50,000 in one case, where he managed to gain access to a woman's business accounts. The scope of his criminal enterprise was staggering, and I felt a mixture of horror and relief knowing that I'd escaped before becoming another statistic in his growing file of victims. But what disturbed me most was learning that Riley wasn't his first accomplice. He'd worked with other women in other cities, always finding someone willing to help him identify and manipulate targets in exchange for a share of the profits. "What about my sister?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "That's more complicated," Detective Santos admitted. "Based on the evidence you've provided, she was clearly involved in planning and executing the con against you. But determining her level of culpability versus her own victimization by Mr. Mitchell requires more investigation." The distinction felt important legally, but emotionally, it made little difference to me. Riley had chosen to participate in my betrayal, regardless of how she'd been recruited or what promises Jake had made to her. The sister I'd grown up with, the one I'd always hoped to have a closer relationship with, had looked me in the eye and systematically helped someone else plan to destroy my life. Over the following weeks, as the police investigation expanded and more victims came forward, a clearer picture emerged of Jake's methods and Riley's role in them. She'd been with him for nearly 2 years, serving as his advanced scout and emotional manipulator in what appeared to be a highly organized criminal enterprise. Riley's social media presence, which I'd always assumed was purely narcissistic, turned out to be an elaborate research tool. She'd used her follower networks and engagement analytics to identify potential targets: women who were successful but isolated, financially stable but emotionally vulnerable. Her sudden trip home hadn't been motivated by sisterly affection, but by the realization that I fit their target profile perfectly. The financial records Rachel had helped me trace revealed the full extent of their operation. Riley had been receiving regular payments from Jake, amounts that coincided with successful cons in other cities. Her lifestyle in Los Angeles, which had always seemed mysteriously funded, was actually supported by the money stolen from women like me across the country. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was that I hadn't been their endgame. According to communications the police recovered from Riley's phone, they'd been planning to take much more than just my business savings. They'd been researching ways to gain access to my client database, my professional equipment, and even my studio lease, apparently planning to steal not just my money but my entire livelihood. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, sitting in Detective Santos's office as she explained what they'd uncovered. Jake hadn't just been planning to rob me, he'd been planning to destroy me completely, leaving me with nothing while he and Riley moved on to their next victim with a fully functioning photography business to sell or exploit. We believe they were planning to execute the final phase of their con within the next few weeks, Detective Santos explained. Probably around the time of your actual wedding, when emotions would be running high and you'd be most likely to make impulsive financial decisions. I thought about the wedding venue Riley had been so enthusiastic about helping me book, the expensive photographers she'd recommended, the elaborate plans that would have required significant upfront payments and financial commitments. Every suggestion she'd made, every helpful recommendation, had been designed to put me deeper in debt and make me more dependent on Jake's supposed financial support. The wedding that I'd been planning as the beginning of my new life would have been the final act of my destruction, with me walking down the aisle toward a man who was planning to leave me with nothing but debt and devastation. But Jake had made one crucial mistake in his calculations. He'd assumed that because I was trusting and generous, I was also naive and helpless. He'd underestimated my intelligence, my resourcefulness, and my ability to see through lies when I finally started looking for the truth. Most importantly, he'd failed to account for the fact that my patience and careful planning could be just as effective as his charm and manipulation. The police investigation moved forward with methodical precision, building a case that would hopefully prevent Jake and Riley from victimizing anyone else. Federal authorities became involved due to the interstate nature of their crimes, and I found myself working with FBI agents who specialized in financial fraud and organized con games. Agent Jennifer Walsh, the lead federal investigator, was particularly interested in the documentation system Rachel and I had developed. Our combination of digital surveillance, financial tracking, and photographic evidence had created what she called a textbook example of how to gather evidence against sophisticated con artists. Most victims realize they've been conned only after the damage is done, Agent Walsh explained during one of our meetings. By then, the perpetrators are long gone, and the evidence is mostly circumstantial. What you've done here is document a con in real time, creating an irrefutable record of their methods and intentions. The compliment felt strange, given that I'd never wanted to become an expert in catching criminals. But there was something satisfying about knowing that my careful documentation might help other women avoid the devastation Jake and Riley had planned for me. As the legal proceedings moved forward, I had to confront the complicated reality of what would happen to Riley. Despite everything she'd done, she was still my sister, and the thought of her facing serious prison time created a conflict between my desire for justice and my lingering family loyalty. Mom struggled with this dilemma even more than I did, torn between horror at what Riley had done and maternal instinct to protect her daughter from the consequences of her actions. Our conversations during this period were painful and necessary, forcing us to examine the family dynamics that had enabled Riley's sense of entitlement and disregard for others. I keep thinking about what I could have done differently, Mom said during one of our long talks in her kitchen, the same room where this whole nightmare had begun months earlier. Maybe if I'd been stricter with her, or made her face consequences for her behavior when she was younger. This isn't your fault, I told her, though I understood her need to find some explanation for how Riley had become someone capable of such betrayal. Riley made her own choices. She's an adult, and she chose to hurt people for money. But even as I said the words, I couldn't entirely escape my own sense of guilt and confusion. Had I missed signs of Riley's true nature over the years? Had my desire for a closer relationship with my sister blinded me to her capacity for manipulation and cruelty? Could I have protected other victims if I'd recognized her true character sooner? These questions haunted me during the weeks following the engagement party, as I tried to rebuild my life and make sense of everything that had happened. My photography business, ironically, was busier than ever, as word spread about my experience and other women reached out wanting to work with someone who understood the importance of seeing clearly and documenting truth. But the most unexpected consequence of exposing Jake and Riley was the response from their previous victims. As news of their arrest spread through law enforcement networks and media coverage, women from across the country began contacting me to share their own experiences and express gratitude that someone had finally stopped them. These conversations were both heartbreaking and empowering, revealing the full scope of damage Jake and Riley had caused, while also demonstrating the resilience and strength of the women they'd targeted. Each story was different in its details, but similar in its arc. Intelligent, successful women who'd been isolated and manipulated by people they'd trusted. People who'd seemed to offer love and support, but were actually calculating predators. Sarah from Denver had lost her entire retirement savings to Jake's investment scam. Maria from Phoenix had her business contacts stolen and used to defraud her clients. Jennifer from Seattle had discovered Jake's true identity only after he'd disappeared, with thousands of dollars and valuable equipment from her medical practice. The worst part wasn't the money, Jennifer told me during one of our phone conversations. It was feeling like such a fool for believing in him, for thinking that someone actually cared about me for who I was rather than what I could provide. I understood that feeling intimately, the way betrayal could make you question not just your judgment about other people but your fundamental worth as a human being. Jake hadn't just stolen money from his victims. He'd stolen their ability to trust, their confidence in their own perceptions, their belief that they deserved genuine love and respect. But talking to these women also revealed something powerful about the human capacity for recovery and growth. Each of them had found ways to rebuild their lives, to regain their confidence, and to use their experiences to help others avoid similar traps. Their resilience inspired me, and helped me see my own experience, not as a humiliating failure, but as a painful lesson that had ultimately made me stronger and wiser. The legal resolution came faster than I'd expected. Jake, whose real name was James Mitchell, was arrested in Nevada while attempting to run the same con on a successful restaurant owner in Las Vegas. Faced with overwhelming evidence from multiple jurisdictions and the testimony of numerous victims, he accepted a plea deal that would put him in federal prison for 15 years. Riley's case was more complicated, involving lengthy negotiations between prosecutors, defense attorneys, and federal investigators, trying to determine her exact level of culpability versus victimization. Eventually, she accepted a plea agreement that acknowledged her role in the conspiracy while recognizing that she'd also been manipulated by Jake. Her sentence was 5 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years if she cooperated fully with ongoing investigations into other aspects of Jake's criminal network. The day her sentencing was announced, I sat in my studio staring at a family photo from Christmas 2 years earlier, trying to reconcile the smiling woman in the picture with the person who'd helped plan my destruction. Mom called that evening, her voice heavy with a grief that went beyond anything a prison sentence could address. "She wants to see you," Mom said, "before she reports to prison next month. She says she needs to apologize, to try to explain." The request created a conflict I hadn't anticipated. Part of me wanted to refuse, to let Riley face the consequences of her actions without the comfort of family forgiveness. But another part of me needed closure, needed to understand how the sister I'd grown up with had become someone capable of such calculated betrayal. I agreed to meet her at a neutral location, a coffee shop in downtown Portland where we could talk privately without the emotional weight of family history surrounding us. When Riley walked in, she looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of her choices and their consequences. "Thank you for coming," she said, settling into the chair across from me with none of her usual confidence or dramatic flair. I wasn't sure you would. I'm not sure why I did, I admitted, studying her face for signs of the manipulative sister I'd discovered, or traces of the person I'd once hoped she could become. What followed was the most honest conversation Riley and I had ever had. A painful excavation of years of resentment, jealousy, and miscommunication that had created the foundation for her ultimate betrayal. She talked about feeling overshadowed by my stability and success, about the pressure of living up to expectations she couldn't meet, about the appeal of Jake's offer to finally have power over the sister who'd always seemed to have everything figured out. I told myself I was just evening the score, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You had the business, the respect, the life that seemed so perfect. I convinced myself that you owed me something, that taking from you wasn't really stealing because you had so much. The explanation didn't excuse her actions, but it helped me understand the twisted logic that had allowed her to justify destroying my life. Riley had never learned to build her own success or create her own happiness. Instead, she'd focused on tearing down what others had accomplished, as if diminishing others could somehow elevate her. Do you understand what you almost took from me? I asked, needing her to acknowledge the full scope of her planned betrayal. Not just money, but my business, my reputation, my ability to trust anyone ever again. I know, she said, tears streaming down her face. I know. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to understand how I became someone capable of that. The meeting lasted 2 hours, covering years of family history and months of criminal planning, with an honesty that felt both devastating and necessary. When we finally stood to leave, Riley reached for my hand, her grip desperate and pleading. Can you ever forgive me? She asked, the question carrying the weight of our entire relationship and its uncertain future. I don't know, I said honestly. Maybe someday, but forgiveness isn't the same as trust, and trust isn't the same as relationship. What you did changed everything between us, permanently. I understand, she whispered, releasing my hand and stepping back. I just needed you to know that I'm sorry, truly sorry for all of it. I watched her walk away, knowing it might be years before I saw her again, and felt a complicated mixture of sadness and relief. The sister I'd always wanted a closer relationship with was going to prison, but the sister who'd betrayed me was finally facing consequences for her actions. Both realities were true simultaneously, and learning to hold them both without contradiction would be part of my ongoing healing process. The federal trial that followed brought media attention I hadn't anticipated, with reporters interested in the story of the photographer who documented her own betrayal and helped bring down a multi-state con operation. I gave a few interviews, hoping that sharing my experience might help other women recognize similar warning signs in their own relationships. But the most meaningful recognition came from Agent Walsh, who asked if I'd be interested in consulting on other financial fraud cases involving romance scams and family manipulation. My combination of photography skills, investigative instincts, and lived experience made me uniquely qualified to help law enforcement understand how sophisticated con artists operated and how victims could protect themselves. You've turned one of the worst experiences of your life into a tool for helping others, Agent Walsh said during our final meeting about Jake's case. That takes incredible strength and wisdom. The compliment felt earned in a way that few things in my life ever had. I'd survived betrayal by the two people I'd trusted most, gathered evidence that helped put dangerous criminals in prison, and found a way to use my painful experience to prevent others from suffering similar losses. The journey from victim to survivor to advocate had been painful but transformative, teaching me capabilities I'd never known I possessed. As I drove home from the federal courthouse after Jake's sentencing, I thought about the woman I'd been a year earlier and the woman I'd become through surviving his and Riley's betrayal. The old Emma had been trusting to a fault, generous with her affection, and naive about people's capacity for deception. The new Emma retained those positive qualities, but had added vigilance, skepticism, and a hard-earned understanding of how to protect herself without becoming cynical or closed off. The engagement ring Jake had given me, which had turned out to be stolen from one of his previous victims, had been returned to its rightful owner through the FBI's Victim Restitution Program. My studio apartment, which had once felt like a temporary space while I waited to build a life with someone else, now felt like home in a way it never had before. I was single again, but not in the desperate, lonely way I'd been before Jake appeared in my life. I was single by choice, taking time to heal and grow and figure out what I actually wanted from a relationship rather than accepting whatever seemed available. The difference felt profound, like the contrast between a hurried snapshot and a carefully composed portrait that captured something true and lasting. The lake house, scene of both my worst betrayal and my greatest triumph, became a place of healing rather than pain. I started spending weekends there, using the quiet and natural beauty to process everything that had happened and plan for whatever came next. The dock where Jake and I had posed for fake romantic photos became my favorite spot for morning coffee and evening reflection, a place where I could remember my own strength and resilience. Sometimes, sitting there with my camera in my lap and the mountain light playing across the water, I would think about the photos Riley had taken that final day, the images she'd captured, thinking she was documenting my downfall, but which actually showed the moment I reclaimed my own power. In those pictures, if you knew how to look, you could see the exact moment when the victim became the victor, when the woman who'd been underestimated revealed her true capabilities. Those were the photos I treasured most, not because they were technically perfect or aesthetically beautiful, but because they documented the most important transformation of my life. They showed the moment when Emma the reliable, Emma the trusting, Emma the easy target became Emma the strategic, Emma the strong, Emma the woman who saw clearly and acted decisively to protect herself and others. The story was far from over, but this chapter was complete, and I was finally ready to start writing the next one. 18 months after the engagement party that changed everything, I stood in the center of my newly expanded photography studio, surrounded by the controlled chaos of a business that had grown beyond anything I'd ever imagined possible. The space that had once been my modest one-room operation had expanded to include 3 separate shooting areas, a client consultation room, and a dedicated office where I could handle the administrative side of what had become a thriving enterprise. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the months following Jake's sentencing and Riley's imprisonment, I'd thrown myself into work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Photography had always been my refuge, but now it became my salvation, the thing that gave structure and meaning to days that might otherwise have been consumed by bitterness and regret. But the real change hadn't been in the physical space or even the financial success. The real change had been in me, in the way I approached my work, my relationships, and my understanding of what it meant to see clearly and capture truth. The woman who'd been naive enough to miss the warning signs of an elaborate con had evolved into someone who could spot deception from across a crowded room and help others develop the same protective instincts. My client base had shifted dramatically since the trial made headlines in photography and small business publications. Word had spread about the photographer who documented her own betrayal and used the evidence to bring down a criminal conspiracy, and suddenly I was attracting clients who wanted more than just beautiful pictures. They wanted someone who understood the importance of seeing beneath the surface, of capturing not just how people looked, but who they really were. Corporate clients hired me to photograph executives and team members, trusting my ability to reveal character and authenticity in professional portraits. Families came to me when they needed someone who could navigate complicated dynamics and capture genuine connections despite underlying tensions. And increasingly, I was working with law enforcement agencies that needed someone who could document evidence with both technical precision and investigative insight. The consulting work with federal agencies had become a significant part of my income, but more importantly, it had given me a sense of purpose that went beyond personal success. Every case I worked on, every con artist I helped expose, every victim I assisted in gathering evidence, felt like another step toward ensuring that what happened to me would happen to fewer other women. Agent Walsh had become both a professional colleague and an unexpected friend, someone who understood the strange combination of trauma and empowerment that came from surviving sophisticated manipulation. She'd introduced me to other women in law enforcement who specialized in financial crimes, creating a network of professionals who were working to change how the justice system handled cases involving romance scams and family betrayal. "You've become something of a legend in certain circles," Agent Walsh told me during one of our regular check-ins. "There are agents in field offices across the country who've studied your documentation methods and started teaching them to other victims." The idea that my painful experience had become a teaching tool for protecting others felt like the kind of redemption I'd never expected to find. The careful systems Rachel and I had developed for gathering evidence were now being used by women across the country who found themselves in similar situations, creating a growing network of people who refused to be victims twice. Rachel herself had parlayed our collaboration into a new career focus, developing digital security and evidence-gathering tools specifically designed for people who suspected they were being deceived by romantic partners or family members. Her technical expertise, combined with our real-world experience, had created innovations that were being adopted by victim advocacy organizations and law enforcement agencies nationwide. "We should probably trademark the phrase defensive documentation," Rachel joked during one of our weekly coffee meetings, which had resumed at Cascade Coffee once the media attention died down. "We've accidentally created a whole new field of personal security." But perhaps the most unexpected development in my new life was the relationship that had grown slowly and naturally from my work with the Federal Task Force on Financial Fraud. Tyler Morrison worked as a forensic accountant for the FBI, specializing in tracing money through complex criminal enterprises like the one Jake and Riley had been running. The irony of his last name hadn't been lost on either of us when Agent Walsh first introduced us at a case consultation meeting. "No relation to your ex-fiancé," Tyler had said with a wry smile that immediately put me at ease. Different spelling, different character, different everything. Our relationship had developed with the kind of careful patience that comes from having learned hard lessons about trust and deception. We'd worked together professionally for months before having our first personal conversation outside of a case meeting. We'd been friends for months after that before either of us acknowledged the growing attraction that made our professional collaboration increasingly difficult to maintain with complete objectivity. "I feel like I should disclose something," Tyler had said during a dinner that had started as a work meeting and gradually evolved into something more personal. "I've read your entire case file. I know everything about what Jake and Riley did to you, and I know how you exposed them. I hope that doesn't make things weird between us." The admission should have made me uncomfortable, but instead it felt liberating. Here was someone who knew the worst thing that had ever happened to me and was still choosing to spend time with me. Not out of pity or curiosity, but out of genuine respect for how I'd handled an impossible situation. "Actually," I'd replied, "it's kind of a relief. No pretending, no gradual revelations, no wondering when I should bring up the fact that my ex-fiancé is in federal prison for running cons on women like me." Tyler's laugh had been warm and genuine, free of the careful sympathy I'd grown tired of receiving from people who didn't know how to respond to my story. "Well, when you put it like that, it does streamline the getting-to-know-you process." Our relationship progressed with deliberate slowness, built on a foundation of professional respect and personal compatibility, rather than the intense romantic fantasy that had characterized my relationship with Jake. Tyler was steady where Jake had been exciting, honest where Jake had been charming, and real where Jake had been performance. More importantly, Tyler understood the work that had become central to my life and identity. He'd seen firsthand how financial predators operated, how they targeted victims, and how difficult it was for survivors to rebuild their lives and learn to trust again. He didn't see my vigilance as paranoia or my independence as rejection. He saw them as hard-earned wisdom that made me stronger and more interesting rather than damaged or difficult. The first time Tyler came to the lake house, nearly a year after we'd started dating, I'd been nervous about sharing the space where so much of my trauma and triumph had played out. But watching him move through the rooms with quiet appreciation, pausing to look at the photos I displayed of family gatherings and peaceful moments, I realized that the house had truly become mine again, rather than a monument to betrayal. "This is where it happened?" he asked when we reached the deck where I'd revealed Jake and Riley's deception to our assembled family and friends. "This is where it ended," I corrected, settling into one of the Adirondack chairs I'd positioned to catch the morning light. "Where I stopped being a victim and became someone who fights back." Tyler sat beside me, following my gaze across the lake to the mountains beyond. "Do you think you'll ever completely trust your own judgment again? About people, I mean." It was the kind of direct question that would have made me uncomfortable coming from anyone else, but Tyler had earned the right to ask difficult things by proving he could handle whatever answers I gave him. "I think I trust my judgment better now than I ever did before," I said after considering the question carefully. Before Jake, I trusted blindly, assumed the best about everyone, ignored warning signs because I wanted to believe in fairy tales. Now I trust thoughtfully, with evidence and verification and healthy skepticism. That sounds lonely, Tyler observed, though his tone was curious rather than critical. It's the opposite of lonely, I replied, reaching for his hand. It's liberating. When you know you can protect yourself, when you know you can see clearly and act decisively, you can afford to be open with people who've earned it. You can choose to trust rather than trusting by default. The conversation had marked a turning point in our relationship, the moment when we both acknowledged that what we were building together was solid enough to withstand the weight of my history and strong enough to support the future we were beginning to envision. Mom had taken longer to come to terms with the new reality of our family, struggling with guilt over Riley's actions and uncertainty about how to maintain a relationship with a daughter who was in federal prison. The weekly visits to the correctional facility in Oregon, where Riley was serving her sentence, had become a painful ritual that left Mom emotionally drained but unwilling to abandon her maternal responsibilities. She seems different, Mom reported after one of these visits. Quieter, more thoughtful. She's been taking classes, working in the library. She says she's trying to understand how she became someone capable of what she did. I'd maintained my own correspondence with Riley through carefully written letters that walked the line between maintaining family connection and protecting my own emotional well-being. Her letters revealed someone who was genuinely grappling with the magnitude of her betrayal and its consequences, but I remained cautious about accepting her expressions of remorse at face value. Riley had been a skilled manipulator long before she met Jake, and the possibility that her apparent transformation was simply another performance designed to generate sympathy and eventual forgiveness couldn't be entirely dismissed. Time would be the ultimate test of whether her rehabilitation was genuine or strategic. The family dynamics had shifted in ways that were both painful and necessary. Uncle Robert and Aunt Susan had become more central figures in my life, providing the steady support and unconditional love that I'd once hoped to receive from Riley. Cousins who'd been peripheral relationships became close friends, bonded by shared values and genuine affection, rather than mere biological connection. Family isn't just who you're related to, Aunt Susan had said during one of our regular phone calls. It's who shows up for you, who supports your growth, who celebrates your successes without jealousy or competition. The wisdom felt particularly relevant as I navigated the complex process of building new relationships while maintaining appropriate boundaries with people who'd proven themselves untrustworthy. Riley would always be my sister, but she'd forfeited the right to be my confidant, my support system, or my automatic forgiveness. Professional recognition for my work in fraud prevention and victim advocacy had led to speaking opportunities that initially terrified me, but gradually became a source of satisfaction and purpose. Standing before audiences of law enforcement professionals, victim advocates, and potential targets of financial fraud, sharing my story and the lessons I'd learned from surviving systematic deception felt like the most meaningful use of my experience. The goal isn't to become paranoid or suspicious of everyone, I would tell these audiences. The goal is to develop the skills to see clearly, to trust your instincts, and to protect yourself without closing yourself off from genuine connection. The presentations invariably included practical advice about documentation, evidence gathering, and self-protection, but they always returned to the central theme of empowerment through knowledge and preparation. I'd learned that victims of sophisticated cons shared certain characteristics: intelligence, success, generosity, and a desire to see the best in people that made them targets, but also gave them the tools to fight back if they understood how to use them. The speaking engagements had led to a book deal, an opportunity to reach an even wider audience, with the story of how documentation and strategic thinking had transformed me from victim to advocate. Writing the book had been emotionally challenging, requiring me to relive every detail of the betrayal and recovery process, but it had also been therapeutic in ways I hadn't anticipated. Seeing clearly how I documented my way out of betrayal and into justice was scheduled for publication in the fall, with early reviews praising both the practical advice and the emotional honesty of my account. The advance orders suggested there was a significant audience of people who needed to hear that survival was possible, that justice could be achieved, and that betrayal could become the foundation for a stronger, more authentic life. Tyler had been my first reader and most honest critic throughout the writing process, helping me balance the need for practical information with respect for the privacy of everyone involved. His perspective as both a law enforcement professional and someone who cared about my well-being had been invaluable in shaping a narrative that could help others without exploiting my own trauma for dramatic effect. You've managed to write about terrible things that happened to you without making yourself sound like either a victim or a superhero, he'd said after reading the final draft. That's harder than it sounds, and more useful than most people realize. The book launch was planned for November, coinciding with National Fraud Awareness Week and the second anniversary of Jake's sentencing. The timing felt symbolically appropriate, marking how far I'd come from the woman who'd been blindsided by betrayal to someone who could help others avoid similar traps. But perhaps the most significant development in my new life was the realization that happiness looked different than I'd expected it to. The old Emma had equated happiness with romance, marriage, traditional markers of success, and social acceptance. The new Emma had discovered that happiness was autonomy, purpose, meaningful work, and relationships built on mutual respect rather than neediness or fantasy. Standing in my expanded studio on a crisp October morning, reviewing the schedule that included corporate shoots, family sessions, and a consultation with FBI agents working on a new romance scam case, I felt a contentment that was deeper and more sustainable than anything I'd experienced during my relationship with Jake. The work was challenging and meaningful. The relationships in my life were honest and supportive. The future was uncertain but full of possibilities that I was equipped to evaluate and pursue with confidence. Most importantly, I knew that I could trust myself to navigate whatever came next, whether it was professional opportunities, personal relationships, or unexpected challenges. Tyler arrived at noon with lunch from the deli down the street, a tradition we'd established for days when my schedule was too packed for a proper meal break. We sat in the consultation area of my studio, surrounded by examples of my recent work, talking about his current cases and my upcoming book promotion schedule. "Any regrets?" he asked, a question that had become a kind of check-in between us, a way of acknowledging the unusual path that had brought us together. "About which part?" I replied, though I knew what he was really asking. "About any of it. The whole experience, the way it changed your life, the work you're doing now instead of the life you thought you wanted." I considered the question seriously, looking around at the studio I'd built, thinking about the women I'd helped, the criminals I'd helped expose, the relationship I was building with someone who knew all my scars and chose to love me anyway. "I regret that other people got hurt," I said finally. "I regret that Jake and Riley made choices that caused so much pain for so many people. But I don't regret how I responded to what they did, and I don't regret who I became because of it. Even if it means you'll never be as trusting as you were before?" "Especially because of that," I said without hesitation. "Blind trust isn't a virtue. It's a vulnerability that puts you and the people who care about you at risk. Learning to trust wisely, to love carefully, to see clearly, that's not damage. That's growth." Tyler smiled. The expression that had first attracted me because it was genuine rather than calculated, warm rather than practiced. "I love your complicated, careful, strategic heart," he said. "It's the safest place I've ever been." Later that evening, after Tyler had returned to his own apartment, and the studio was quiet except for the soft hum of equipment and the distant sounds of downtown Riverside settling into night, I sat at my desk reviewing the final proofs for a family portrait session I'd completed that weekend. The family had been referred to me by Agent Walsh, a woman whose husband had been running financial scams that she'd discovered and reported to authorities. The portrait session had been part of her healing process, a way of documenting her family as it really was, rather than as she'd been led to believe it was. Looking at the images I'd captured, I could see the story they told. A strong woman surrounded by children who adored her, all of them moving forward together despite the betrayal that had shattered their previous understanding of their life. The photos were beautiful but also honest, showing both vulnerability and resilience, both loss and hope. They were exactly the kind of pictures I'd always wanted to take, images that captured truth rather than fantasy, strength rather than perfection. The woman I'd become through surviving Jake and Riley's betrayal was finally the photographer I'd always wanted to be, someone who could see clearly and help others do the same. As I prepared to close the studio for the night, my phone chimed with a text message from a number I didn't recognize. For a moment, the old anxiety flickered. Would I ever stop having that initial moment of fear when unknown numbers appeared on my screen? But I opened the message anyway. Miss Chen, my name is Sandra Walsh. Agent Walsh gave me your contact information. I think my boyfriend might be running a con on me, and I need help documenting what's happening. Could we meet this week? I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling the familiar mixture of sadness and determination that came with each new case. Another woman facing betrayal. Another person who needed help seeing clearly and protecting herself. Another opportunity to transform my painful experience into something that could prevent someone else's destruction. I typed back quickly. Yes, we can meet. You're not alone in this, and you're stronger than you know. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. work for you? The response came immediately. Yes, thank you. I don't know what I would have done if I couldn't find someone who understood. I smiled, thinking about the woman I'd been 2 years earlier, desperate and alone, and convinced that no one could possibly understand what I was going through. Now I was the person that other women found when they needed someone who understood. Someone who'd been through the darkness and emerged with both scars and wisdom. Turning off the lights in my studio and locking the door behind me, I walked out into the cool evening air with the satisfaction that comes from work that matters, relationships that sustain, and a future that held promise rather than fear. The story that had begun with betrayal and devastation had become something larger and more meaningful, a narrative of survival, justice, and the power of seeing clearly in a world full of beautiful lies. Tomorrow, I would help another woman document her way to safety and justice. Tonight, I would go home to my apartment that was truly mine, to my life that I'd built with my own hands and protected with my own wisdom, and rest in the knowledge that I was exactly who I was meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.